Alright, well, like I said, starting promptly at 4, started the recording, and uh, hopefully more people will join us in a bit. But right now, we have to move on. Last time we stopped at disaster preparedness. Now we're ready to move on to a pretty big topic: impact of societal institutions on Caribbean people. So, there are many parts of this. Um, so it goes family, education, religion. Uh, yeah, it's those three: family, education, religion. Um, I think we should get through all of them today, but who knows? It's a big topic. So, impact of societal institutions on Caribbean people. Main idea: the different family forms, the role of family, and the changing roles of women in the family are required to be understood in the space of the Caribbean. So the syllabus specifically focuses on women when it talks about, whenever it looks at gender roles or gender in general, it specifically focuses on women. But of course, you know, you can't have one without the other, and so a holistic look at the Caribbean and the gender roles and the gender dynamics of the Caribbean has to look at both women and men, especially in family. Okay, so the one of the key terms that you're going to have to know when talking about family in the Caribbean is matriarchal, which is a family system where women um, fill the role of the head of the family. Now, the Caribbean has an interesting family structure. It's not unique in the world necessarily, in that European colonialism has impacted the ways in which families can develop all over the world. But in the Caribbean, you have the unique position of the role of men being reduced to production of children. And so, okay, so what happened was, especially in the British slave trade, part of the systems that the British employed in order to systematically break the African people who they were bringing into slavery and the people who were born into the Caribbean and slavery in the Caribbean. One of the systems that they employed in order to do that successfully was to undermine and destroy, to the best of their ability, any sort of family structure that African people had. So when they were bringing people over from Africa, they they took special care not to put people who are of the same family um, close together. They took care not to let people who spoke the same language or came from the same um, village or the same city or the same tribe, the same clan. Um, they took care not to allow those people to be together, um, so that they limited communication, they limited people's closeness or association with people with whom they might have been familiar, with their family members. So they separated mothers from sons and siblings. They separated parents from children. They separated siblings from each other. They made the family connections as weak as possible, because in doing so, the people become both socially and psychologically weak, and it becomes easier to mm, conditioning is the term that was used, to condition them to be, slaves in this system of complete dehumanization. And so, what happens in a situation like that, where they're trying their best to destroy family completely, is that men are taken out of the picture of their children's lives altogether. They can't do that with the mothers. If they could, they would, but they can't because the mother has to carry the child for 9 months. The mother has to feed the child, nurse the child herself, and there's a certain amount of child care that mothers have to do. And so, for the baby to actually reach an age where they can do physical labor, they had to allow mothers some contact with their babies. But fathers were not seen as necessary um, for the like purely physical animalistic way in which the African people were being treated. And so what happened was African men were they were referred to as studs, and bred the same way as horses or other kinds of cattle, where you have um, one like you have strong, healthy males who are sent around to various plantations to impregnate females in order to produce strong offspring from in order to give the females strong offspring, and they don't stay on any particular plantation, they don't stay in any particular social or family unit, because they are reduced again to production of their children. And the way I'm describing it is animalistic because that's the system. The system that they were using was a system that was used for animals, but they were applying it to these African people. And so the that's where the modern concept of a stud comes from. It's a relic of the dehumanizing chattel slavery. And because, men were not allowed to be fathers, they were only, their only function in the lives of their children was to start the life, but they were to have as little contact as possible as the British could orchestrate with the child as a human being. Um, you have a system where mothers are the only parents, and so the slave society is a fatherless society. It's not that they didn't have any male figure or male influence in their life because they did have the slaveholders or the planters, and so a lot of people's last names um, are the last names of the plantation owner and name of the plantation itself. So, for example, a lot of African people with European last names, um, it's a very common sight in the Caribbean and also to some extent on the African continent, where eventually the Europeans did go and perpetuate their colonialism on the continent. But African people with European last names is very common in the Caribbean, and the reason for that is because these babies who were born um, with no family structure, no father, at least no connection, no contact, no fathering from their biological father, um, were functionally made to be as children of the plantation, not the planter, but the plantation. Sometimes they were the actual children of the planter. Sometimes a planter would, or a slave owner, a massa, you might say, would have a child with an African woman, a slave woman, and of course that child, even though they are the child of a slave owner, that child is a slave. Their status is that of a slave, which really speaks to the savagery of the European chattel slavery, that a man has a child, and because of his mother's identity, that child is automatically um, given into chattel slavery, and that child is less than human. The implications of it, of course, when you consider it, are that these planters were having children with um, beings who, according to their ethical and legal system, were not human. They were giving birth to children who themselves were less than human. And so, again, speaks to the savagery of chattel slavery, but that's the reality of it. And so, all of that background leads to a modern Caribbean where, certainly among Afro-Caribbean people, Black people, the descendants of the African slaves in the Caribbean, there is this matriarchal family system. It's not the system they brought from Africa, um, but it's the system that emerged in the Caribbean, where you have a fatherless society. Slave society is a fatherless society, necessarily. It's part of what they had to do to ensure that slave society was successful, was to keep fathers from fathering their children and keep children from being fathered by their fathers. And so all that leads to the matriarchal system, and it's not any one gender's fault. So no one gender is to blame. Um, in the modern Caribbean, and again, Caribbean studies is just the life that you live and the experiences that you have all around you. Um, and we're just putting some fancy intellectual academic words to it. But I'm sure you are very familiar with the concept. A man has a child, and taking care of that child is not seen as his responsibility, either by him or by the mother of that child, or by the grandmother or aunt or cousins of that child, all female, who are the ones who actually do the child raising. And the man, again, is simply treated as the progenitor, the one who is responsible for producing the child physically. Um, there's also, of course, the idea of child support, where a man also has to make financial contribution to his child's upbringing. We also have in the Caribbean a very common concept of the visiting father, where a man who has children is not father in their household, not head of their household, not um, you know a father to them, but he is a man who visits occasionally, who they see occasionally, who is not um, head of their household, who is not the head of the children. And so it creates an entirely new um, social construct of this visiting father that is in some ways unique to the Caribbean. Certainly the way that it exists in the Caribbean and, well, not just the Caribbean, but the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. All of the places where the family structure um, has suffered directly from British colonialism and slavery. You have this concept of the visiting father, which is an entirely new um, construct in any social system. As again, this is not the family structure that these people would have brought from Africa, because it's not a family structure, family system that civilized people come up with on their own. It is the result of the duress and the dehumanizing and inhumane conditions of the history of Caribbean people being removed from family. That being said, what has resulted in the modern day is also referred to as family, different kind of family, but nonetheless, it is the unit of people who are related to each other, living together and being part of the same social group. So Murdoch, 1949, argues that the family performs four basic functions: um, sexual, reproductive, economic, and educational. Um, so there's the fact that sexual and reproductive are different is no accident, um, and that's not something that the syllabus goes into in depth, but it does mention Murdoch and his um, writings. So if something like this is one of the things that you might be interested in, you might want to write an essay on, you can go ahead and look into Murdoch some more. That's Murdoch 1949. If you just Google Murdoch 1949 um, family you should find the text that is being referenced here. Due to industrialization in North America and Europe, there has been a decline in the extended family and an increase in the nuclear family, since it is easier to relocate the immediate family when um, securing jobs in different territories. So this is again um, another perspective of theorizing about the family structure in the modern Western world, and specifically in the Caribbean. So in the African societies where the Caribbean people would have come from, also in India, as we're going to look at next, um, in Indian societies, especially in a lot of Indian society, um, you have more extended family than nuclear family. And so the family unit is not considered to simply be parents and their children, but family units often span more than just those two generations and are, aunts and uncles living not necessarily in the same house, but in the same compound, in the same complex of houses that functionally um, act as one large social family unit. So a lot of, like, for example, African languages may have words that reflect this idea. So you have for example, the Ethiopian language Amharic, you have a word called you have two words for family. You have the word Betesaboch, which is so the word Beit means house, and so Betesaboch refers to your household, your immediate nuclear family. But you also have Zemedoch, and Zemedoch refers to your extended family. Um, that's not really something that the English language makes accommodation for. You just add the word extended onto family. They're not two separate um, societal concepts that are both like normal parts of the the family structure that English speaking people would have had either in um, Europe or that they would have brought and reproduced in the Caribbean. Um, it's more of the nuclear family. That's like what they mean when they say family. And so, again, industrialization had an impact on the structure of family, where the extended family that would have been um, prevalent socially in Europe and North America would have declined and decreased because the Industrial Revolution made it more convenient to have a nuclear family, a smaller family unit. So, for example, people relocating from rural to urban environments for new jobs during the Industrial Revolution and post-industrialism, post-industrialization. If you're going to relocate a family, it's easier to relocate 4 or 5 people, just the parents and the children, rather than relocating the entire clan. Like, for example, Jacob and his 12 sons and their wives and their children all relocating from Israel to Egypt in the days when Joseph was prime minister of Egypt, and you had the famine in Israel, and that whole family picked up and relocated into Egypt. That's not really how family functions in an industrialized world. We also have a note about the family in Nayar society, Nayar, in Kerala in India, that centers around women who may have several husbands who take no responsibility in taking care of the offspring. That's not really particularly relevant to the Caribbean, but that is kind of an interesting point that they bring up just to show you that there are different models of family in different parts of the world that have to do with different philosophies and different religions. Um, and so the family is not as it, it's not as strictly universal as you might think of it in the Caribbean. However, the next key point, sociologically, the family is considered to be universal. Sociologists contend that family exists in most societies. The form of it might be different, but family itself exists in most, if not all, human society. Sociologically, the family performs certain functions to ensure the smooth running of society, and this is connected to the idea that the family is the unit of a society and the unit of a nation, which I'm sure you've heard at some point. In the Caribbean, there are many forms that have been shaped by historical and contemporary events, and the role of members in the family, and especially the women, have undergone significant changes. Again, we talked about all of those. We talked about the Caribbean phenomenon of mothers fathering, because of all of those historical factors and sociological factors that lead to Caribbean societies being fatherless, both as a result of intentional pressures, um, intentional destruction of family by the Europeans, and also of the perpetuation and propagation of the systems that started then but have continued nowadays, the roots of the fruits of colonialism, leading to the same fatherless societies that you are familiar with in the Caribbean. Any questions before we move on to education?
No, sir.
Okay, I,
Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, now in that case, we'll move on to education. So next up, impact of societal institutions on Caribbean people. The societal institution that we're looking at is education. The main idea is that education shapes the Caribbean region. Various theoretical perspectives and major historical and contemporary events have contributed to education in the Caribbean. We have quite a few key terms, and we're also going to look at some sociological perspectives on education. So we're going to do that functionalist perspective and conflict perspective again. Um, First, some key terms. One, hegemony or hegemony. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I'm preferential to hegemony. So hegemony is leadership or dominance, particularly by one group. That's the definition it's given. But to understand it better, hegemony simply means a dominance of any particular thing or any particular way of doing things. For example, advertising. Um, there are different ways of thinking of advertising as a um, society, as a culture. Um, for example, the BBC is famous for not allowing advertising on BBC Radio or any BBC broadcast because it is functioning as public broadcasting. It's a public service, and so it's not to be. It would be improper and unethical for it to be used as a vehicle for individual private companies or private interests to propagate their marketing, their advertising campaigns. In the United States of America, this is quite the opposite, and TV basically runs on ads. Serving advertisements is the primary function of television. So, whereas on a British comedy or game show or a panel show, you might hear if a product, a specific product or brand name is mentioned, people will immediately go other. Let's say if they mention Toblerone, they'll say other brands of expensive chocolate are available. Or if they mention um, Toyota, they'll say other like affordable family cars are available. And they treat it as a joke. They treat it as just the thing because that is part of the culture. The idea that advertising is not um, the primary purpose of television, and advertising, television should be an advertising neutral space, is part of the culture of of British television and British entertainment in general, um, because of the standard set by the BBC. But in the United States of America, it's quite the opposite. Game shows are very often sponsored by a whole host of companies. Sometimes there are game shows that exist purely to um, purely as marketing vehicles for a particular product or a particular brand. And when you see the way that advertising is done in other places throughout the world, not just looking at the US and the UK, you notice the influence that the American model of advertising has had on television and entertainment generally around the world, that is a hegemony. That is an American advertising hegemony. Um, and that's personally my favorite example of what hegemony is and what hegemony means. It's this way of doing things that was originally the way that one group of people did things, but because of their cultural, economic, and financial influence and power, that way of doing things has spread and become dominant in many other parts of the world where it did not originate, where it's not indigenous to. That's a hegemony. And so you can have, for example, hegemony of a particular religion in a particular country. And so you have bank holidays for Christian holidays, but no bank holidays for other religious holidays or festivals or observances. You could have linguistic hegemony. So a country may have a large, like the United States of America, may have a large portion or large proportion of Spanish speakers, but the official language of the country is still English. And whereas in some countries, like lots of European countries or a European, yeah, lots of European countries, lots of African countries, Asian countries, you might have road signs, for example, signs on businesses and maps and so on, might be in multiple different languages. South Africa is a fun example because South Africa has about 11 official languages, and so it would be very very rare in a country like South Africa to see a road sign or some sort of signage that you want to be generally like publicly understood. It would be very rare to see that in just one language. But in the United States of America, because you have a linguistic hegemony, um, you have it's one language. It's English. If you are in the United States, you have to speak English. If you want to migrate to the United States, you have to learn English. Um, there's a certain amount of English language proficiency because English is the official language of the country, and so there are certain public services, federal services, um, like government agencies and so on that you'll have to engage with, which you have to know English in order to properly interact with. That's a linguistic hegemony. So yeah, that's just to get the idea of hegemony into your heads to understand what hegemony truly is and what hegemony means, so that when you either see the term or intend to use the term, you have a very good idea of what it is. Next key term, hidden curriculum. Norms, values, and attitudes of a school which are conveyed but not taught explicitly. So schools have curricula. A school has certain things that it intends to teach you. So there are grammar schools, for example, and they are meant to teach you how to be someone who uses language proficiently, how to be well read, how to be someone who is proficient in mathematics, how to be someone. There are trade schools that are meant to teach you a certain skill, whether that's woodworking or plumbing or electronics. Um, there are schools that are known as like prestigious athletic schools. So if you are at this school, the curriculum may center around not just the sport or the athletics, but around what it takes to be uh, an individual athlete, how to market yourself, how to get sports sponsorships, um, how like getting onto a team, travel, and all these different things. Schools have different focuses, and all of that is in the curriculum, which is just what the school teaches you and what the school is telling you that it's teaching you. But you also have the hidden curriculum. This idea of the hidden curriculum is that each school has a particular ethos or a particular mentality, some um, something that being attending this school will is to be socialized into any student attending this school because it may be intentional, it may be unintentional, it may be just a result of this this is a result of the history of the school or a result of some cultural influence that has been had on the school or a cultural influence that is currently being had on the school. For example, if the school is seen as prestigious, then anybody who is rich enough to afford to actually influence where their child goes with money, um, they are the parents of the school, and they form the PTA and they form the parent body, and the way that they socialize their children and the culture of these rich people influences the culture of the school. If a school is seen as prestigious, then the staff that get attracted to that kind of environment are the kind of staff who would perpetuate this culture or a hidden curriculum of elitism. My dad often says of the secondary school that he attended and that I also attended, that this is a school that is training its students, preparing its students to run the country. And not every school has that same ethos, because not every school is seen as the top school in the island. Not every school is seen as the best and has all of that prestige. And so all of these schools um, are said to have hidden curricula, and these hidden curricula have to do with the philosophy of the school. The ethos of the school is a good word that you might use for hidden curriculum. So yeah, they are the norms, values, and attitudes of a school which are conveyed but not taught explicitly. So very often that has to do with elitism. Sometimes it has to do with athleticism. Sometimes it has to do with labor or leadership or power. But yeah, hidden curriculum is something that, again, the syllabus doesn't go into too much detail on, but if that's something that might interest you, if the socialization function of education in society is something that might interest you, that's definitely something that you're going to want to take a good look at. You would certainly be able to write a very interesting, very appealing essay if you looked at the hidden curricula and the ethos of schools in the Caribbean. So, schooling in the Caribbean and education in the Caribbean, there's no influence on Caribbean education that is not the influence of the colonial powers. It's not that other societies didn't have or don't have traditional methods or values around education. It's not that the Indians or the Chinese or even the West Africans that came didn't have their own approaches to education. It's not like the indigenous people of the Caribbean, the Amerindians, the Taino, the Kalinago. It's not like they didn't have their own systems for educating children, educating members of society, and preparing them to be functional members of society. It's not like those didn't exist, but the none of those are really continuous with the systems of education that dominate in the Caribbean. There are, of course, exceptions. So a lot of education and kind of the societal roots of education systems and schools are religious. So schools really started as a function of either churches or mosques or whatever religious social system was set up. Similarly, like with welfare programs and all these things, they originally had their roots in religious systems. So it's not as prevalent in a country like Barbados, but a country like Trinidad, as cosmopolitan as it is, as ethnically and religiously diverse as it is a very, very good example of a Caribbean country where the religious influence on education is a lot more prevalent and a lot more visible, because you have what are known as RC schools, which are the schools set up by the Roman Catholic parish churches. You have the Hindu schools and the Muslim schools, um, and they are a lot more prevalent than they are in other places in the Caribbean. They have a lot more um, demography behind them, a lot more population power behind them. They have, um, they're established aspects and parts of the society. But colonial education is different. Colonial education is more secular in its focus and in its origins. Um, we're about to run out of time on this meeting, so I'll end it, restart it, and then we'll get right into colonial education. Okay, so we're back. Um, right, so colonial education. Colonial education facilitated the continuation of European dominance in the following ways. It promoted white superiority and black inferiority. It inculcated into Caribbean people um, to promote European culture, and it led to the cultural erasure of traditional cultures and values. So yeah, colonial education was different from even from the kind of industrial age education systems that started in Europe and in the United States. Because the way that the white and to use broad terms now, the way that the white people educated white children was not the same way that the white people educated black children. And so in places where majority of education was white people teaching white children, you had one kind of colonial education or one kind of European education in the era of colonialism. But in places like in the Caribbean, where the majority of education was white people teaching black people children, um, education functioned differently, and colonial education was, emphasis on the colonial part of colonial education because that's what it served to do. It was a perpetuation of colonialism through the education system. Yes, it promoted white superiority and black inferiority. It inculcated into Caribbean people um, the idea that they should promote European culture, and it just promoted European culture generally. It led to cultural erasure of traditional cultures and values. So, for example, they would have only taught English, and like there would have never been anything close to any sort of recognition of any of the Creoles or Caribbean dialects of English or the Creoles that had been created by these Caribbean people as a result of attempting to learn the English language under duress. There would have never been any sort of linguistic recognition of any of that. No. If you're learning how to use language, you're learning how to use European language as the Europeans speak it. These were people who, a few generations ago, their parents were not speaking any European language. They were not speaking English. They were probably speaking Arabic or an African dialect of Arabic or one of the one of the many, many African languages that they would have been speaking. Or you had, for example, Indian and Chinese people who would have been speaking one of the many Indian languages or a Chinese language. You may have had indigenous people of the Caribbean region who had their own languages. None of those children from any of those ethnic backgrounds would have learned anything other than European languages. And so, by that, colonial education promotes European hegemony and it erases traditional cultures and traditional values. I don't know how much international news you follow, but there was recently quite a lot of talk about the boarding schools that were set up in the United States and Canada. It was specifically, the news was about Canada, where they found a lot of like the human remains of Indigenous Canadian children who would have been who would have suffered some serious abuses and inhumanities um, in these boarding schools, because again, these boarding schools were um, uh, they were intended to socialize. The best way to describe it is just use the language that they used: kill the Indian and save the man. Um, and when they say Indian, they're referring to the indigenous people of the Caribbean, who we might refer to as Amerindian. But yeah, that was the idea that was prevalent both in the North American colonial education and also, to some extent, it's different because they were dealing with people who they had brought from other places rather than the people who they came and found. But the colonial approach was the same. It was to kill the Indian, or in the case of the Caribbean, to kill the Negro and save the man. They they were all about turning these people from what they saw as subhuman um, people with dark skin and heathen or pagan languages and pagan religions, turned them into human beings because they did not see them as human beings. They were subhuman. That was the whole point. And so, yeah, that phrase, kill the Indian, save the man, that pretty much sums up the philosophy of colonial education. And so that's a quote you might want to pull out when you're writing an essay if you decide to do it on colonial education and the damage that colonial education has done in to cultures and traditions and values and people and languages. It's all about cultural erasure, cultural dominance of the European cultures that were perpetuated by colonial education. Both British, French, Spanish, Dutch, whatever European colonial power um, had the control wherever they were. Various educational reports have come about in Caribbean history to explain the state of education in the Caribbean. And again, if you want to write about education, if you want to like focus on that as an essay topic, then you might want to look into one, the Keenan report. Um, that's Keenan, Keenan, Keenan. The Keenan report for Trinidad. That's from 1869. You have the Mitchinson report, Mitchinson, Mitchinson. The Mitchinson report, that's 1876. You have the Lum report, which is Lumb, the Lum report of Jamaica in 1898. You have Major Bain Gray's report of British Guiana, or Guyana, as we know it today. Bain Gray is Baingray. Major Bain Gray's report of British Guiana. That's 1925. And the names of reports will always sound quite old and stodgy. But these are the education reports, and they report on the state of the schooling, how successful colonial education is in socializing and colonizing the children of African descent or Indian descent or wherever they come from. Um, and they're quite thorough reports. These reports that were often written back to the European powers about the state of things in the colonies. And so, if you would like to get a glimpse of what life was like in the European colonies of the Caribbean, you won't really be able to get a comprehensive report of what life was like for the people who were the oppressed class. But the best thing that you can do from these reports that were sent back to Europe, written by like commissioners or stipendiary magistrates or whoever, would have been sent by the colonial mother in Europe to come down and like check on the state of the colonies, essentially. These reports do give you a good glimpse of what, at least from the European perspective of reporting, what life was like in the colonies. So they're not just limited to education. I'm sure you can find reports on all sorts of things, but that would take quite a bit of research. So again, if it's something that interests you, dive into it. I'm sure you'll find a lot. Okay, theoretical perspectives. So we're looking at two theoretical perspectives to explain the role of education in society. And as I said, they are the functionalist perspective and the conflict perspective. Major factors such as colonialism, enslavement, and indentureship, as well as contemporary factors such as globalization, have influenced education. And that means that they have had influences on these two perspectives that through which you would look at education. So we've talked about these perspectives before, but just as a brief summary, the functionalist perspective of something is a perspective that looks at, for example, an institution or an entity, and looks at what it does, what role it serves, what function it serves in society. So it looks at education and um, it sees what is education doing. Education serves to socialize. Education serves to indoctrinate. Education serves to give people a social group. You make friends at school because that's just where you're spending so much of your time, and you're with these people, for 6, 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, for multiple years of your life. You grew up with these people. These are your formative years and these formative experiences, and so school will serve to give you a social group. It will serve to be the environment in which a lot of your key developmental milestones happen during your various formative years. whether that's the developmental milestones of the years that you'd be in primary education or the developmental milestones of adolescence in your secondary education. That's what school serves to do. So that's a functionalist perspective, whereas a conflict perspective is the perspective that looks at specifically a societal institution through the lens of conflict, through antagonism and enmity. Who is like what are the opposing viewpoints? What are the opposing incentives? Who is in conflict with whom in this system? So let's actually look at it, and I'll show you what I mean. The functionalist perspective on education is that education provides skills that enable people to function efficiently in their society, and that advancement is based on merit, ability, and skills. So, if you look at the history of European education, especially around the era of the Industrial Revolution, education outside of its roots as religious people educating their children and socializing their religious people into their religion. If you look at the origins of a more secular, more industrial education, it has to do with preparing people to work in society, preparing people to work in factories, especially because this is the industrial revolution we're talking about. So preparing people to work in an industrialized world. Um, and the functionalist perspective on education also claims that in an education system, advancement is a meritocracy. It's based on ability, it's based on skills. What you do gets assessed, and your role in society, your function in society, your advancement in society is based on those assessments. And so, education, from a functionalist perspective, is a meritocracy. And we have a lot of these ocracy words, especially in Caribbean studies. Ocracy simply has to do with ruling. So autocracy means, um, one entity doing all of the ruling. You have plantocracy, which is where an agricultural plant of people who own plantations and farms, they're the ones doing the ruling. You have democracy, which comes from the Greek demo, people. So that's people ruling. You have theocracy, which is a system where a country's religious affiliation means that they recognize God, or whichever God they believe in and serve, as the ruler of their country, and they structure their country around God being, recognized as the leader. In this case, you have meritocracy. Meritocracy is about the people who are in charge are the people who are best suited to be in charge, whether that's by some system of assessment or simply by some evaluation. The point is, meritocracy is about the people who are in charge, the people who deserve to be in charge by virtue not of divine appointment or familial superiority, but by the their ability and their competency. And so school is, by the functionalist perspective, supposed to function as a meritocracy. The conflict perspective on education is quite different. It states that education perpetuates a class struggle or conflict. Education reinforces class systems and classism. So in Barbados, and I'm sure it's quite similar in other Caribbean islands, but it's very profound and prevalent in Barbados. The secondary school that you attend follows you for the rest of your life, because the system by which people get into secondary school is a nationwide competitive system, and there are certain schools which are the most competitive, and they are the schools where the top performers are sent, and so they're the schools that are the most desirable or the most desired. And so it's the schools are ranked, and these rankings are sometimes contested, sometimes debated, but known to all, both to people who are no longer in school and people who are like around the school system and people who are directly in the school system. The students themselves um, know these rankings, and these rankings are not something that really matters so much at the bottom of the ladder. So the lowest ranked school in the island, the second lowest and the third lowest, they don't really know or care about their rankings and their positions relative to each other. But these rankings really do matter quite a lot at the top of the ladder. And so you have these top four schools, which are known as the top schools. They are ranked in order, and then you have schools underneath. which are, and once you get past the top four, which are like the top schools, you have also there's there's also some sort of ranking, some idea of ranking, below there, but it's less relevant in those lower rungs of the ladder. And so all of this goes to show you just how effective school is at perpetuating a class struggle. And again, it's a conflict perspective. It's looking at an institution with respect to how it perpetuates a struggle, how it functions on the basis of a conflict. It's about who is opposed to who, which incentives are opposed to which incentives, who wants opposing things, who functions in opposing ways. What is the opposition inherent in this system? What is the antagonism inherent in this system? Right. So conflict theorists argue that workers are never adequately remunerated for the work they do, and this prevents them from achieving upward social mobility. So this this is more so just looking at conflict theory in general, but you can apply it to education, because, for example, the school that you go to, as I said, in the Caribbean and specifically in a place like Barbados, which is the example that I have to draw on from personal experience and lived experience, um, the school that you attend, the secondary school that you attend, follows you for the rest of your life. And so when people see these secondary schools on your resume, they put you in a box. They have an idea of who you are, what kind of worker you are, what kind of student you were, what kind of member of society you are, based on the school that you attended. They have an idea of your social class. They have an idea of your socioeconomic status. They have an idea of how connected you are, how well read you are, how well spoken you will be, all from that secondary school on your resume. There's a similar thing with education, with higher education, tertiary education, or university level education, but that's less prevalent here in the Caribbean because the higher education is not as there's not as many players in that game. So the competition of higher education that you have in foreign countries is not as prevalent here in the Caribbean, where you know university education pretty much means the University of the West Indies, or let's say you have a community college. There might be some foreign medical school that comes in, and so that's like a tertiary education option. But general higher education in the Caribbean pretty much means the University of the West Indies. There's sort of a monopoly on higher education, the same way that there is a monopoly on primary and secondary examining. So you have the Caribbean Examinations Council. That is the monopoly over, like, they are the examining board in the Caribbean. They are the educational board in the Caribbean. And while the individual ministries of education in any given Caribbean country or territory are supposed to have a certain level of influence because of the monopolistic role that the Caribbean Examinations Council has in Caribbean education, and it's region wide. The yeah, the individual ministries of education are kind of subject to the Caribbean Examinations Council. Their jurisdiction being regional rather than local means that no individual government, I mean, functionally, because it's supposed to work differently, but functionally, no individual government can take them to task or, for example, take them to court. Um, uh, they don't really answer to anyone. The Caribbean Examinations Council sort of acts as a law unto itself. As you could see recently, if you looked at the scandal where the first CSEC and CAPE examinations that were done during the pandemic and under pandemic conditions, there was a lot of grading uh, controversy with that group of students, um, and there was a whole big thing. But in the course of that, what we learned is that the Caribbean Examinations Council um, has a kind of monopolistic hold over education and examining and accreditation and secondary level qualifications in the Caribbean. And that's also another complex perspective through which you could look at education in the Caribbean. Education is about social mobility. It has a direct and quite significant um, impact on social mobility. And so, yeah, that's another conflict perspective through which you can look at education. Um, we have 4 minutes till 5, so I don't think we're going to be able to cover religion today. Um, we've talked about religion, here and there, now and then, in the various classes that we've done so far, because religion is such a fundamental and pervasive aspect of the human experience. But we're going to get on to the impact of religion on Caribbean people. We'll do that next week. So we'll start from religion next week, and we'll then move on to Caribbean art forms and Caribbean global interactions, as well as um, sports, religion, and political systems in the region and their positive and negative effects. Um, and that's also going to come under Caribbean global interactions. And that will be the end of Module 1. And we will have gotten through Module 1. I think by next week. Next week should be the last class that we do in Module 1. Just these last few topics. And then we will move on to Module 2, which has to do with issues in Caribbean development. And that's the big one. That's going to be a lot of information. It's a very, very dense, very heavy syllabus. It's not boring by any means, so you should be able to stay awake for it. But yeah, it's no joke. This is one of these syllabus. This is a syllabus where there's a lot of content. It's quite heavy. It's quite, it doesn't really build on a whole lot of what may have been done before, but you can get through it. It's again, it's still just the life that you live every day, the experiences that you see every day. It's your Caribbean that you live in. We're just putting a bunch of academic fancy words to your lived experience. And so when we get to that, you'll see that I'll try to make it as accessible as possible, because it is a lot of, sociological and political and economic language and jargon and a lot of concepts that really aren't accessible to people of our age, because we don't really participate in these systems. But we can make it accessible, and that's hopefully what we will do in the next few weeks and months as we go through Module 2. Any questions on the topics that we covered today?
Um, no, sir. I didn't realize application was that impactful though. But other than that, no questions from me.
Yeah, you will be surprised. Now you are currently like in the throes of the education system. You're in the bubble. Once you have gotten out of it, you will be able to look at it from a different perspective. And I think it will be very interesting when you get to look at the the role that education has in society once you are outside of the system. Okay, everyone is satisfied. Thank you all for your time and your attention. Sorry about last week. I came down with the flu. I am back now, and if I don't want us to, have missed too much or have to make up for too much, if you have questions, you can put them in the Discord, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you for coming, and God willing, we will see each other again next week.